Check out the new Friendo U lineup at friendoshop.com and use promo code FRIENDO2024 to get 20% off store-wide. Hey, Friendo, Steve here.
And Larson.
And it's time for us to talk about, as I zoom in a little bit, the Vince McMahon documentary appropriately titled Mr. McMahon.
Mr. McMahon.
That's right, a 6-episode series on Netflix. Everybody's been talking about it. There's been, whenever things like this come out, there's always like tons of memes and witty observations on Twitter.
Yeah.
Which is usually the most entertaining aspect of it. For example, still of Bret Hart saying, "I was a true artist."
Yeah.
Which I think we can all agree with. So I guess we can talk sort of like broad strokes first. Like,
whenever we approach these, especially wrestling documentaries. So a lot of the early reviews, a lot of immediate criticism I saw about it, again in broad strokes, was it didn't cover a whole lot of new ground over the span of the 6 hours. And so when it comes to wrestling documentaries that aren't just made by WWE, the question I always feel like needs to be posed is, who is this made for? Is it made for wrestling fans? Is it
not
made
us.
for people? No, it's not, because we know most of the stuff.
It's made for your average Netflix viewer who is
Yes.
interested in documentaries and they want something that is compelling. So that's who it's made for.
Yes.
I mean, look, we know 98% of that's my main takeaway from this is it was 95% of this was a WWF, WWE, modern day WWF, WWE historical documentary. You said earlier when we were off camera on pre-show, I think, from earlier today, basically a Wikipedia entry for
a lot of stuff.
for WWE going back about 1980. I mean, really started like they glossed over anything interesting. That's the thing about this is I know there are plenty of people, and there are probably plenty of people in our audience, because I saw some in the comments when we started very loosely discussing it. People who aren't aware of a lot of that stuff. I mean, we're old. We lived through this stuff, and so we've accumulated the history of the WWE, both through, WWE produced stuff and stuff outside of WWE.
Yes.
So we have kind of like even a well-rounded view of what they think of themselves or what they want to put out there.
Yes.
And what, to a degree, the real record is.
Yeah.
And I feel like instead of asking who is this made for, I feel like when we analyze our expectations, or at least our questions going into it, the question that I have for you is, was any of that answered? When we ask ourselves, is this going to be a puff piece? Is this going to be an exploration? Are they going to try to tell a story at all rooted in truth? Do you think they attempted that? Do you think they accomplished any of that?
I don't think it was a puff piece, but I also don't think it was the gotcha piece that Bruce Pritchard said it was. Not even close. Here's the thing, is they address all... You described it earlier today when we were talking about it as almost more of a WWE documentary as opposed to a documentary necessarily solely focused on Vince himself.
With the understanding that in obviously many ways you cannot separate.
You can't separate them, obviously not, no. But rather than looking at Vince through the lens of running WWE, it was this tale of running WWE because Vince was running it, essentially. If that delineation makes sense. I don't think it was a puff piece. I don't think they answered a whole lot of the questions that we had going into it. You posed 3 questions to me, and I believe my answer to each of those is no. I don't think it went into... Nothing about this documentary challenged the official mythology or narrative that has existed for years about the story of WWE and Vince running the company. I can't think of anything that really was in any sort of depth challenged. I mean, you had the thing where people were saying, 93,000 at WrestleMania 3, and then you have that cut to Meltzer, 78,000. And then you had Shoemaker following that. It's like, we'll never know the real number, but then it doesn't matter, and that, in kind of a nutshell, was a lot of stuff where they relied on this technique throughout where something could be put forward, whether by Vince or somebody else. Someone would say something to contradict it, or visually they'd show something to contradict it, but there wouldn't be an exploration past that. For the most part, there was this sequence where he was talking about how the Attitude Era. It was it was still family friendly programming. It's like there was no murder, and then it shows or no death or something like that, and shows a grave site, and there was no weapons, and it shows Pillman with the gun. But there's no pushing of Vince or anybody to get past. There's like so many contradictions that Vince puts out there, and a couple times he's pushed enough to try to put up some sort of explanation as to why that is. At one point he says, well, I got to say different things sometimes. There's what I think and what I got to say as a business person.
That came pretty early on, and I think that right there was one of the lines where I thought it was most interesting, because that kind of thing happened a lot.
Yes.
When he is pushed on Turner poaching a lot of the talent.
That's when he said about, I got to say different things, yeah.
And he says, and to preface that, at first he says, well, no, Turner wanted to hurt me. I wanted to help my own business. And the producer says, well, those are linked. Those are one and the same. Don't you feel that way? And you can tell Vince knows 1,000% that, yeah, he got aside. Wild how billionaires will play victim like that and then criticize those who actually have reason to feel victimized. They themselves have no problem. Oh, poor me, the billionaire that had his talent poached because I didn't know what to do with them, or I let them go.
I could afford to pay him as much as the competitor. Yeah.
Right, exactly. Yeah. So there are multiple times in this where he played victim, which is ironic because at a certain point he wasn't a victim, but as a child, he very clearly was a victim of some harsh abuse, both physical both in terms of, I don't know verbally the delineation between sexual abuse and physical abuse, but from both sides, being beat on and also sexually abused as a child. At least that second one, the insinuation was there, I believe, stemming from a Playboy interview that he gave. Mm-hmm. But he explains in the documentary about like just the active physical abuse that occurred during his childhood and how, but dude, here's the thing. In order to get any sort of truth, you need alternate viewpoints that are in the know that can be corroborated. Mm-hmm. And with Vince McMahon, he himself talks about his childhood, but there's no way to elaborate or corroborate without other firsthand witnesses to that.
Yeah. And
they either don't exist or, I know his brother has passed, his mother recently, or she's still with it. I remember his mom was like super old.
Yeah.
And I forget in the last couple of years if she passed. I honestly forget.
I don't recall.
But that was and even there's basically one harsh, knowledgeable, dissenting voice, and that was Mushnick. That was the columnist who spent his if Vince is to frame it, his entire career, finding dirt with his vendetta against WWF. And the way Mushnick explains it is just a normal explanation. It's most people write this off because it's silly pro wrestling. I wasn't going to do that because real lives are being hurt. Real lives are affected by the various, machinations of Vince McMahon.
Yep.
But beyond that, there's a lot that just isn't corroborated, which is interesting to me because one of the things about Vince, and you see this with, they talk about Trump in the documentary, but what's the one thing more than anything that Trump values above all else? Loyalty, right? It's the one thing he does not care if you, this, that, the other, as long as you're loyal to me. Don't be loyal to country. Don't be loyal to party. Be loyal to Trump, right? McMahon is obviously cut from the same cloth. There are very many parallels between the two. Yeah. We all know that. That's not a surprise. And people are very hesitant. If you haven't been, if it's not somebody like Arita Chatterton, who's a literal victim of him, or if it's not somebody like Phil Mushnick, who, you know, through his journalism was trying to expose what Vince was doing, there really wasn't anybody on the inside who had insider knowledge, like a Bruce Pritchard type, that would then go on record and say, well, this is the deal.
Well, there was literally one point where Jimmy Hart was asked a question. He pauses and says, I don't know what they want getting out there.
Yeah, right.
Like, and you know, there's still people that are who used to work directly under Vince in years past, who now may be under Legends deals. It seemed like the one former wrestler in this interview who spoke pretty directly was Tony Atlas.
Yeah, he was great in this. Yeah.
He didn't seem like he was holding back.
And they used him for some of those counterpoints as well when Vince talked about Vince really tried to. Obviously, Vince has an incredibly complex relationship with his father, you know, obviously now deceased. But when there's this whole extended bit where Vince is talking up his dad and, I really wanted to love him and he loved me. And on his deathbed, he basically said, and then it just cuts to Tony. He says, I don't think he liked his dad, And when you get a read on their relationship, I wouldn't either. I mean, you and I are incredibly lucky people given the fathers that we were blessed with. And it's a horrifying relationship, and it clearly is the thing that traumatized him enough to lead him down to both extreme success and extreme failure as a human being.
Yeah. But again, that's not something. I mean, they go into childhood, and he talks, a bit about his relationship with his father. And one thing they don't get into is beyond maybe with Shane. There's a bit in the fifth episode when it focuses more so on the McMahon family.
That was the most interesting episode.
It was. And specifically Shane, and how the USA executive mentioned that Shane was kind of the outcast of the family.
Black sheep of this family, yeah.
And Shane talks about his father's approval.
Yeah.
He wanted that validation. And that's something Vince talked about, that he struggled to get that same validation from his own father.
Yeah.
And it's interesting, rather than reflecting on his own upbringing and his own relationship with his father, that rather than saying, all right, I understand how, maybe he doesn't understand this, seeing how this affected me, I'm not going to behave in the same manner. Instead of the situation where this is how things are, and therefore this is how I'm going to treat people as an adult. And it was Shane, and it was anybody who worked under him in WWE, because he seemed to, on a regular basis, basically weaponize his approval.
Yeah.
And you have so many wrestlers who've talked about wanting Vince's approval.
Every single wrestler, that, with the exception of maybe Cody, they all talked about, I have a father relation. He's like a father figure to me. And I remember CM Punk in I think it was the MMA Hour interview. I think it was that one. Yeah. Said, I never got that. I never wanted that. And I never had that with him, which is why we probably butted heads the way we did. He says, yeah, that was sick because a lot of people had that. And yeah, I mean, it would be so much more interesting if there was a deeper psychological dive into it. But even in the end, when, the lawsuit stuff is looked at, it's sort of left on. Did you feel that it was left on the same note that it would have been left on had the lawsuit stuff hadn't come out? Because they sort of like then wrapped it up again in the very end.
Well, if you're talking about Vince's quote about
the legacy thing.
Well, because it's towards the end of the sixth episode too, where he says, a legacy. I don't think I have one, I think is what he said. And that's when he also talked about how So early on, like the very opening quotes from him are essentially is, I don't really want anybody to know who I am.
Mm-hmm.
I wish I could tell the real stories, but I can't and I'm not going to.
Yeah, and you're literally opening up with, okay, well, I can't trust anything he's going to say. You
Exactly.
can't trust anything Hogan's going to say.
Exactly.
And given that, it's funny because given that the power structure at the time of the interviews was as it was, nobody was going to say anything.
No.
You know?
No. I mean, like literally Jimmy Hart was like, I don't know what the company wants out there, so I'm hesitant to be forthcoming.
Yeah.
So I'm getting to answer the question. Later on, they asked Vince, what are the similarities between you and the Mr. McMahon character? And he goes, nothing.
No.
I don't think there's any similarities. And they immediately cut to like 5 different people. It's like, no, they're basically one and the same. It's Vince turned up.
Yeah. Even Pritchard said that.
Yeah. So at the end, he talks about the potential overlap between who he thinks Vince McMahon is as a person versus Mr. McMahon, the character. And he talks about there could be a blend of the two, an overlap.
Yeah.
I kind of feel like, if this documentary was released in early 2022, it probably would have been the same kind of conclusion.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
I feel that's
think
the
so.
case.
We'll talk about it a little bit more. Let's go ahead and pay some bills, Larson. What do you say?
Let's do it. Let's take a break here. Get a word from the sponsor of today's episode, Tecovas. When I was a kid, Steve, I used to have a pair of Western boots. I used to wear them all the time. But here's the thing. Sitting here right now, adult Larson, thinking about it, I don't know if I could pull off wearing boots like that now.
Of course you couldn't pull off wearing those boots right now when you were a kid. Because it'd be too small for you. Like you're a little kid at the time. Your feet are way bigger now.
Oh, my gosh.
I'll tell you this, though. I do think you could totally pull off wearing a pair of Tecovas. Tecovas crafts quality Western boots for everybody, from ranchers to cowboys to first-time boot buyers like yourself. Tecovas reviews are off the charts positive, with Esquire saying, quote, "There's a reason we keep coming back to Tecovas." A lot of reviewers mention that they fit great, they're easy to put on, and super comfortable. They're going to feel right out of the box. Plus, with Tecovas' Best in the West guarantee, you get free returns and exchanges for 30 days.
Wow. Fit great, easy to put on, and comfortable. Sounds like I owe it to my feet to pull on a pair of Tecovas. Right now, get 10% off at tecovas.com/raw when you sign up for email and text. That's 10% off at tecovas.com/raw. tecovas.com/raw. See site for details. Tecovas. Point your toes west. So getting to the idea. So the trailer for this documentary, when it was released, it had the quote, I think, from Vince about the overlap. I mean, based on the title of the documentary, that was the direction they were heading.
Right.
Essentially, where does Vince McMahon end and Mr. McMahon begin? Are they one and the same?
Yeah.
And again, even that thematically, over the span of the 6 hours, really wasn't investigated that much.
It wasn't. I mean, that's why I maintain this is basically like a thesis less. A thesis.
Well, it was an evidence-less thesis, essentially. It was like, we're putting this thesis out. We're barely going to.
Do you think that's what the thesis was? I mean, they're like, hey, let's throw this out there. But it could be, as opposed to the Flair thing. Where that was hammered hard.
Oh,
that
absolutely,
was the thesis.
I mean, he basically said at the end, I don't like Richard Fleer. I like being Ric Flair, so I just went all in on that. And based on the trailer, that seemed to be the direction they were going with this.
Right, but it just ended up being, it's sad because there's so much more that it could have been. I mean, if you want to look at it from, I mentioned the Trump thing earlier. If you want to look at it, an exploration of a narcissist, you can do that. An exploration of a capitalist scumbag who's taken advantage of his workers. They had the whole section about the unionization, and Hogan just happily, freely copying. The one truthful thing he said is that he ran straight to Vince on that one.
Yeah, that's the one thing I believe. That's the one thing I definitely believe.
But there's a lot of other things you could have explored, but none of it was really explored.
So Paul Heyman had maybe the one single most astute observation about Vince in the entire 6 hours. And I wrote down the quote directly because it's interesting. So he says that believes he says the Shakespearean tragedy of Vince's success was driven by the overcompensatory behavior rebelling against the first miserable 12 years of his life, and escaping that abuse has been his life pursuit, in creating an atmosphere in which he is untouchable and invulnerable to outside forces, in control of his own destiny.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and then they punctuate that. I know it's also in your notes here. It was close together by Vince insisting that he never look back, that he always looks forward because he does not want to reflect on that. But clearly that is so informing what he is as a person.
Yeah.
It's just, and that's a fascinating subject, but that was like a mere fraction of the thesis. I mean, it was literally just sort of a recounting of what happened, throughout his person. It wasn't even, honestly, the most interesting stuff in his career wasn't even touched. Dude, I've been and I know you know this, for a couple of years now, I've been reading that Death of the Territories book, right?
Yeah. On and
because,
off,
You know why? Because it's in my car, and once a week, Bama has me go to the school. Instead of just pulling up and grabbing her, I got to park, I go up there, I see her, and walk around with her. And so in order to get a decent parking space, I got to get there early.
Yeah.
And so I'll read a little bit of that book. That's how I'm consuming
5-10 minutes at a time. Yeah.
It's just ended up in my car. But I'm on a page 143 at this point out of probably 300 pages, 250 maybe. And the actual time that he spent decimating the territories from 82 to 84, whatever it was, is fascinating. Because for all the bluster about how much he put into WrestleMania 1, and he had to mortgage the house or get a second mortgage on the house or whatever it was. Bro, he was cutting checks for hundreds of thousands of dollars. You know how much he bought Stampede Wrestling for? $1 million.
Yeah.
Where did that shit come from?
Yeah.
Like if he had to do everything he could to put all that money in WrestleMania, how did he afford all this shit? You know what I mean? Like the process of going from territory to territory, that's fascinating, but he can't even remember that Sable filed a lawsuit against him, so I don't know if he'd be a good... But you got to figure there's probably still plenty of people around that have a first or maybe secondhand account of those days, and you got to ask yourself, his activity during that, upending the entire business of pro wrestling and basically backstabbing every alliance that his father had already made, where's that 2 episodes right there that should have been.
I know. We've heard the story of WrestleMania 1, 2, and 3
ad nauseum
countless times. We don't need that again.
No,
we don't need it. I know it's. Yeah, but I guess again, if this is made for the broadest, most general audience, people who are not necessarily wrestling fans, they might probably aren't as aware of the details of WrestleMania 1, 2, 3, at least the myth that's been kind of formed around that. The creation myth of Vince's WWE and WrestleMania is put out there by the company.
Well, no, I think you're right, dude. I think that this is for the people who remember the Stone Colds, who remember the Hulk Hogans, and are
who don't watch every week, who don't watch the documentaries,
who might not have watched for a very long time.
Yeah. Getting back to the Vince. So one thing based on the trailer, I was interested, and I've talked about it before, what this documentary was going to explore. Was the thesis going to be Vince got lost in the Mr. McMahon character? Or did the Mr. McMahon character give Vince a conduit to put out there whatever was going on in his head already? And we don't get an answer in this. There was one instance where Vince is talking about how, he's talking about the abuse he suffered as a child and talked about how he doesn't want to look back. He says, I don't subscribe to the idea that people who were abused become abusers themselves. And right after that, they cut to several images of Vince having his talent doing degrading things.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
And that's the closest they get to exploring really in depth any of that.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, there is the parallel also. I mean, it's along the same lines as when he was accused of sexual assault harassment in the tanning salon, where like 2 weeks later, he recreated that essentially.
Yeah.
Or not recreated, but he gave his version of it, a twisted version of it on television.
Yes.
So yes, there are many moments where the hypocrisy just shines through, but to not challenge him on it. And I wonder if it's because any attempt to challenge him on it would result in, well, I say one thing and I think another thing, and that's how you control a person's perception. Because that's what he said. And it's like, okay, well, we're not getting. And on top of that, he does have the ability, the power to simply walk away. And it seems like he barely wants to be there in the first place. And obviously he didn't show up for the final interview because it dropped in coordination with the lawsuit, or it was supposed to happen around the same time. But yeah, I mean, the Mushnick stuff, pretty much anytime he was on screen, it was pretty interesting because again, you have the one person that, understands that, as he says, because he's a dirtbag, Vince McMahon is a carny and a dirtbag. There's a couple of funny gotcha moments, like when Stephanie from an interview in 2013 is asked about the Mike Tyson stuff. It's like, well, she was like, had he already been arrested for rape? And somebody was like, yeah, he had. And she was like,
when she was asked about pitches,
oh, it's so uncomfortable.
It was so awkward that she didn't want to do. And she just said, yeah, but I don't want to get into it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, right, yeah.
And then Vince talks about it like it's this hilarious idea.
Mm-hmm.
He's chuckling his way through his answer.
Yeah. And she talked about it like on a WWE-produced documentary. I think that was one of the weird ones that involved her and Vince. I forget if it was that one or if it was a different one. But I remember like there was old footage of her in a WWE-produced documentary where she talks about that as well.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I don't know. There was, I will say, there's also little things that were pretty amusing. And anytime Bret Hart opens his mouth, is pretty great. But it's funny because, unfortunately, and what was kind of interesting also was, especially when you take into account when these interviews were done, Triple H was not as effusive of Vince McMahon as some of the other people were. And if you remember, it was around this time that he had the heart stuff and he was being removed from duties. Mm-hmm. And we're still unsure, like, okay,
what the dynamic was and all that. Yeah.
Right. Exactly.
Business level.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
From a business level. And of course, that's obviously going to affect the
personal. Yeah.
The fact that he's family.
Yeah.
So that was that was just interesting to me. I mean, there were some things that were hilarious to me. One of which I do appreciate because it's never been this blunt before. But when they introduce WCW as competition and they show like clip after clip after clip of just how shitty their gimmicks were, and it was basically just like WCW is basically in '93 like Fun Wrestling or We Book Raw or whatever, just absolutely terrible stuff. Some of the editing was very clever in this.
Yeah.
Hulk Hogan saying, yeah, it was a turbulent time back in '93 because people were booing me. It's like there's all this stuff about the steroid trial and how like that's just killing morale backstage and revenues down. He said, yeah, it was a real turbulent time because, a lot of the people were booing Hulkamania back then, brother. Yeah. Well, that ain't got nothing to do with the steroid trial, buddy.
No. You pointed this out to me, a little funny tidbit that Bruce Pritchard credits the creation of the Attitude Era to Shawn Michaels stuffing his shorts.
So this debate I've seen relatively recently online, and I forget exactly where, but I think it might have been in one of our threads. I don't know, but people saying, I remember I saw one recently that said the beginning of the Attitude Era was the creation of the NWO because that then forced Vince to rethink everything. Yeah. And so when they bring up the Attitude Era and somebody asked Pritchard, when did the Attitude Era begin? I was like, oh, I was going to say Goldust, because that was a real controversial character that was spawned technically during the end of the New Generation. And he brings up Shawn Michaels. Vince isn't at TV. Shawn Michaels takes some gauze and like a roll of it and stuffs his pants. He's wearing tiny bike shorts, and comes down, and Vince was pissed off the next time he saw him. He was like, "The hell was that? You're going to be suspended and fined." And he's like, "Nah, Vince, you get the reaction."
Yeah. Yes, it was hilarious.
It was hilarious. And so I guess that spurned the idea into Vince, hey, we should start doing this more often.
Because then after that, so I can't remember who it was. Someone was saying, Vince was telling everybody, Shawn Michaels has attitude.
Yeah, he's got attitude. Yeah. Yeah.
Again, nothing, the official story. Again, another official story that wasn't challenged, the Montreal Screwjob. Vince had to get the title off Brett that night, but he didn't.
Yeah. I still maintain that Vince was probably in the right on that one.
But again, it's a situation, that's a story that's well told. We know the details. We know the inner workings. Dark Side of the Ring spent a whole half hour talking about the details. And Meltzer was interviewed on that, and not a single sound. Meltzer was all over this thing.
He was all over this. Yeah.
And even they didn't even get Meltzer saying, well, nah, you didn't have to do it that night. Nothing like that.
Yeah. I wonder if, because but wasn't it then the next day was Monday, and WCW could have announced that they had Brett under contract.
Well, why would they? Because Bischoff said he could stay another month to drop the belt the next pay-per-view, but why would they announce? You know what I mean? Like, if Bischoff's going to give Brett that month
because you're not going to trust him to do that.
To do business the right way.
Because you're not going to trust that he's not going to do something shady like that. I kind of feel that. I mean, I don't know. I kind of assume that, that was a make or break situation. Because I don't think Brett's ever been like, yeah, no, I just could have done it later, and this would have been, it would have totally. I think that their back was up against the wall on that one. I'll have to think about that one again. Oh, you know what I thought? There was a couple other little interesting bits. When Hogan talks about his first promo with the NWO, he fucking lights up over the idea that it was just him.
Yeah.
And I'd never really noticed that before when Hogan talked about that stuff. He was like, finally, no longer people can say, oh, he's just, it's just Vince behind him doing everything and this, that, and the other. He's like, no, this was all me. He was so proud of the fact that he was doing something that was actually getting a legitimate big reaction, and it didn't have anything to do with Vince.
Because earlier on he said, all the stuff that he did is Hogan was from Vince. Vince was feeding them all the stuff.
Right.
He'd be like, hey, we're going to do this here, and then he would do it.
And they cut to footage of that actually happening.
Yeah.
Episode 4 starts with, and this was the kind of thing that I just really wish they would have explored more. Vince, at the beginning of episode 4, telling people who his favorite wrestler was growing up, Dr. Jerry Graham. Mm-hmm. And I'm like, dude, to understand Vince's perception of pro wrestling, to do a deep dive on that, I thought could have been really, really fascinating. Again, maybe that's not the kind of thing that your standard Netflix audience is going to appreciate.
Yeah.
But I think that could have been interesting. I thought that was an interesting little tidbit.
Yeah, this seemed like there was a lot of missed opportunities to really dive deeper into just more and not do so much of, well, in this year this happened. Well, this year this happened. Well, Hogan left, so now Brett's going to be the next guy,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Like, and even then, there's a way I feel like you could do a more exploration, a more in-depth exploration of Vince, and use the history of the WB to tie things together, on a deeper level, as opposed to, but at the same time, if he prefaces this whole thing saying, well, I don't want anybody to know who I am, and I'm not going to tell you the real stories, I don't know what they have.
Yeah.
What's on the cutting room floor? Did they have trouble beyond Meltzer and Mushnick finding people who would contradict anything, any part of the official story for a lot of this stuff? I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, it might be I don't know about a unique situation necessarily, but people who can speak with authority from a firsthand nature,
who feel freely to speak as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
There seem to be so many people who were measuring their words when answering these questions. And at the end, when the question is posed, what's Vince's legacy? Booker T, Cena, so many people, they didn't know what to say. Undertaker, he was tripping over his words.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Oh,
the only person that
forever.
the only person that gave a clear answer was Tony Atlas.
Yeah. 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 Oh, that's right. Vince did clearly say about his childhood, there's fighting, infighting, and incest. Those were his words. They speed ran like the Ruthless Aggression era.
They did.
Like they spent so much detail on the Hogan years and the Attitude Era, and they speed ran that.
Yeah.
Talked about Cena. Talked about the UFC, which is just kind of an interesting footnote. But you got to appreciate the honesty of Vince. He's like, I don't know how to run that.
Yeah.
You know, I deal with characters in fiction. That's a sport. Shane wanted it.
Use your own money, essentially.
Use your own money.
He said use your own money, but he couldn't do that, could he?
He didn't.
He didn't have the money to do it, and Vince wasn't going to lend him the money.
Would you have been able to stick the dagger in his chest?
That was crazy. Although I feel like, you know, from the outside, you hear that story, it's like, wow, that's nuts. That shit probably happened like at least once a week. You know what I mean?
Yeah, right. Yeah,
and not just with Shane, with a bunch of people. So the story was essentially that Shane and Vince were butting heads over a story idea or a creative idea, and Vince was eating something, and eventually he puts a knife in Shane's hand, or whatever. He takes a knife and is like, all right, if you want your idea to happen, you essentially have to stab me in the heart.
Yeah.
And if you're not willing to do that, that says a lot about you, doesn't it, Shane?
Right. Like, okay, yeah, I don't want to commit murder right now, right here. Like, what the hell?
One thing we didn't mention regarding episode 5 is there's a good portion of that about how Vince, during the Ruthless Aggression era, booked himself as lecherous.
Yeah, scumbag, yeah.
Yeah, and how he would always justify all these segments by saying, oh, I was just playing a character.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, right, yeah.
You know, but the thing is that he wrote himself as that character.
Yeah. It's funny because they make the point during the show. I think Shoemaker makes the point during the show. He says, you know, he's writing himself this way, but he is the boss. So if anybody has any objections to it, it's really difficult to say, no, I don't want to do this, or you're crossing a line. There are no checks there. Yes. It'd be one thing if he was writing, you know, another performer to be a certain way, which he did. But for it to be him portraying this character, number one, that's just a horrible abuse of power and a conflict of interest there. But also number two, you gotta ask, okay, where's his head at with this stuff? You know, because I remember that was one of the things that sort of I dropped out over with wrestling was there was just too much Vince. Like there was just too much Vince involved. And it wasn't like in 98 where, yeah, there was a ton of Vince, but like at least it was entertaining. This seemed to be just salacious for the point of salacious. I remember ages ago, it's so funny we talk about wrestlers willing to comment about this because Trish Stratus is one of the people that was interviewed. And she talked about, you know, were certain wrestlers, and she's kind of coy about it, but not really, were certain wrestlers worried about being punished? Yes, we were. And were we? Yes, it seemed like we might have been. She talked about losing the title 2 weeks after not agreeing to do like a lesbian scene with one of the wrestlers. But I distinctly remember because she talks about the bark like a dog stuff.
Yeah.
And I distinctly remember years ago her giving an interview with her saying, he didn't get his real comeuppance from me in response to that. And in this, she kind of asked, they frame it as if she did during the Shane versus Vince match.
Yeah.
And she, if I recall correctly, kind of goes along with that. There might have been something on the cutting room floor where she echoes the same sentiment before. Mm-hmm. But for them to focus on that specifically and not bring up that grievance that I know she had, I thought was probably a disservice to that. But yeah, I mean, clearly that is, and again, it's sort of the kind of thing that the people interviewed about it, you could tell were uncomfortable with it. And several of them said, yeah, we crossed the line. But then there was always the caveat. Well, things were different back then. You know, like we followed the trends. We didn't set the trends. They always fell back on that.
They did. That was
which
their
is
defense.
a cop out.
It is. It's totally a cop out. is 1,000% a cop out because, talking about the salacious aspects of the Attitude Era specifically. And that was the thing. Vince was going on. Well, we were following the trends. We weren't setting the trends. We were just following where culture was going. And of course, they throw a bunch of B-roll of like Girls Gone Wild and Springer and stuff like that on the screen. But at the same time, then I can't remember who it was. There was, what her name was. But there was a bit of a counter to that. It's like, you're in a position where you could address some of these issues that are going on in the culture right now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, right. Yeah.
And rather than addressing them, you went along with it.
You just leaned into them and doubled down on them.
Exactly.
Yeah. Let's talk about this really quick because it was making the rounds. And they talk about Chris Benoit and the safety and health of the wrestlers. And there was a moment when, and I've always thought that this guy could have been, Chris Nowinski could have been a Mania main event guy. Mm-hmm. He had the look, he had obviously the intelligence, the charisma, but he also got concussed, and that took him out of the game, and he turned that legitimate Harvard degree into a life of investigating and uncovering the dangers of CTE. Mm-hmm. Which was, obviously back in the early 2000s, not something really that was known about or discussed or whatever. And talked about him receiving permission from Benoit's father to examine the brain. And, he had said it was the worst they had ever seen. And it was highly damaged. And Stone Cold Steve Austin talked about, well, I probably had one concussion during my entire career. And when you know what you're doing, you don't get concussed. When you know how to bump. And then he said, "I'm not a CTE guy. I just don't believe in it." What was your take on that?
Well, I mean, I saw his reaction to the suit, or like the reaction they cut to, because I think it was a wider shot of his reaction to saying that, assuming that's, one led to the other directly. And he seemed to be aware at the time, like, it's probably not going to go over very well.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Because not. We don't know. Again, that based on how it was edited, if there was more there's more context, because it was fairly vague, as in he doesn't believe in the idea of CTE. He doesn't believe that CTE played a role.
Right, yeah.
And what Benoit did. There's a lot of ambiguity in terms of what that means, or, I don't believe I have CTE. I don't know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah.
It's ambiguous and it's vague what it exactly relates to, but it makes it seem in very broad strokes he doesn't think CTE is a real thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. It was interesting to hear Undertaker be completely honest about them taking away chair shots.
Yeah.
This is a staple in pro wrestling. How are we going to get by without unprotected chair shots to the head? And of course they show a montage of them, and it's just horrific. It's absolutely horrific what they're doing. But that sort of dove into a little bit more. I mean, it is, and it's funny because Nowinski's even asked, do you think WWE's compliance with, your findings on CTE and their agreement to work with you on this, do you think that was out of their own business interests or out of a legitimate desire to improve the health of the wrestlers? Mm-hmm. And he said, I can't say one way or the other, but they're doing it.
Yeah.
And I think he said something like, there's no reason why they can't be linked, why one can't be in coordination with another. And that does make all the sense in the world.
It does. It's interesting that Vince reached out to him about it.
Yeah, it is. It is. Yeah, it is. I mean, you got to think at a certain point, it's like, yeah, they broached the topic in the same conversation of pills. And that was one I was incredibly, you can't be anything but disappointed and disheartened to hear Vince say, well, they take pills recreationally. And, it's like, man, they're taking pills because they're fucked up.
Because they're wrestling 300 days a year.
And it's like also the same thing with when Vince talked about Chris Benoit. Chris Benoit didn't kill his family because of CTE. It was because he went nuts. I'm like, well, dude, if your brain is fucked up, that's kind of the definition, I think, of nuts. Yeah, people who act a certain way or behave a certain way, it's just your brain chemistry. Mm-hmm. So like, yes, he's nuts because he fucking took too many hits on the head or whatever it is.
Yeah.
And on top of that, and that going back to the Austin thing, And we mentioned that we talked about this a little bit, so I know you know what I'm about to say, but I wonder if Austin's take was, I don't believe CTE is the driving force behind behavior, because plenty of people who have not had CTE behave in monstrous ways as well. And I think that's a legitimate thought in the first place. But I wonder if that's Vince's take as well, is, when people blame it on diving headbutts, maybe it's not that. But I know Benoit had taken many chair shots to the head.
Yeah,
he had
protected,
yeah. I mean, he was an intense guy in the ring. We all know that.
Yeah. I mean, they show footage of him get dumped right on top of his head a couple times.
The one they did. The one that's wild is Undertaker saying, I was concussed. I don't remember most of that match. And Vince saying, I don't think he was concussed. He was traumatized by having to lose the streak to Brock. What the fuck? Undertaker, dude, in that, what was it called? Last Ride documentary? Whatever it was called. That dude did not give a shit about putting people over or any of that stuff. Undertaker from day one was best for business guy.
Yeah.
And so the idea that, like, he's going back, like, he's doubting the Undertaker, saying that he was concussed in that match.
I know.
Was incredibly silly.
It was. Vince is asked about Owen Hart's death.
Yeah.
And trying to justify continuing the show.
That's one, I'll be honest, maybe this is a hot take, maybe this is an unpopular opinion. That's one that even I kind of struggle with a little bit. Because the points that he made are actually, in my opinion, fairly sound. You have 10,000 people, most of whom do not know what happened. You got a lot of kids there. So do you stop the show and tell them what happened? That's a tough one. And I understand also from the point of view of, you're going to have these wrestlers wrestle knowing what happened.
Because they showed the interview Jeff Jarrett had to do right afterwards.
Dude, that was burned in my psyche, because I remember that shit. Because me and Jeff came home. We were out doing something else. We came home and we found out through AOL message boards. My girlfriend at the time had recorded it on pay-per-view because she had one of them black boxes. And so I think there's a statute of limitation on that. And so we watched it knowing what had happened. And when you see that Jeff Jarrett interview, it's heartbreaking. You can't forget that.
No.
You can't forget that. So I absolutely 1,000% understand the perspective of the wrestlers, for the most part, are in the know. They know what happened. Ask them to go out there and perform. That is a tall task. I'm just saying, in my opinion, it doesn't feel like a cut and dry thing. It just doesn't.
No, it's not obviously a cut and dry thing. No, I it's a subjective thing. And Vince says, well, it was dark because they're running a video, or they're running a interview with Owen they recorded earlier in the day, so no one saw what happened.
Well, yeah.
But it's not completely pitch black in the arena when they run those promos.
Yeah, no,
you can kind of see what's going on. And people probably heard Owen falling.
Oh, yeah.
And they saw him being tended to by medical personnel. His blood was stained on the mat for the rest of the show.
It was. And I'm not saying that they shouldn't have stopped the show. I'm just saying I kind of understand in the moment it's a unique situation. You got 10,000 people there. If you stop the show, what do you feed them? Do you say there's been some technical issues, so unfortunately the show is going to be over, or refunding everybody? I would understand. And that would probably be where I lean. That would absolutely be where I lean. That being said, it doesn't seem to be like the monstrous decision that it's been made out to be. In my opinion, I mean, that's
when people are in situations that are chaotic and emotions are high, and people are forced to make a decision in that state, it might not be the decision they would make after further consideration.
And you also, here's the other thing about that, is that you cannot give Vince the benefit of the doubt.
No,
That's the
absolutely
other
not.
thing,
That's
is
the
that
other
he's
thing.
got such a history of being a piece of shit. You got to figure, okay, well, whatever decision this guy's makes might not be the right
Because
one.
he gives, he talks about, the arena was dark. No one saw what happened. They didn't say anything. They announced to the TV audience what had happened to
yeah.
Owen, but they didn't say anything to anybody in the arena. And he uses all those things as reasons why he didn't stop the show. And he says that, and like, all right, from perspective, I don't necessarily agree, but I understand. But then he says, well, if I had fallen, would I want the show to go on? Of course. I'm like, all
Oh
right.
yeah, no, exactly. And when that's the sentiment that's driving the point of view, it's like, okay, dude, that's not like you're turning a decision that, yeah, a correct, like a normal person would, have a hard time with, and you're kind of taking the wrong tack with it.
Exactly.
So I look, like I said, I think the right decision probably would have been stop the show. That being said, I have seen so much discourse about like, oh, this guy is just the worst piece of shit because he didn't. And I'm like, well, look, he's a piece of shit. I don't
Without a
know
doubt.
if that decision is illustrative of that.
I mean,
but
you could go into Vince being a piece of shit for why Owen was up there in the first place. And
yeah, absolutely.
another thing that wasn't mentioned is the Vince breaks it down how the equipment used on Owen's harness was faulty, and they sued the manufacturer for it. My understanding, there's a lot more to it than that.
Oh yeah, yeah.
And Vince is not entirely blameless, or the WWE isn't entirely blameless either. So
Yeah.
I think David Bixenspan has written a lot about it. So
Yeah.
that's one of the things he mentioned on social media about that aspect of it. But again, that's not challenged whatsoever.
Yeah. This part I thought was actually incredibly interesting because it sort of answered, and maybe this has been out there. I don't listen to his podcast beyond a couple of years ago when you and I would do, retro reviews, but Bruce Pritchard, he's the only guy that showed up after the fact to basically defend Vince's name. They asked him, what did you think of the first 5 episodes? And he said, I thought it was a gotcha piece, and they're like, well, what's missing? And he said his humanity. And then he told a story that, again, maybe has been out there. I don't know. I'm not a Bruce Pritchard aficionado. But it was crystal clear now why he defends Vince so much. And that's because 24 years ago, Bruce Pritchard's wife got diagnosed with cancer. And she was given 4 years to live. And Vince McMahon ponied up to get her, in Bruce's estimation, the best care in the world. And that was 24 years ago. I'll never blame that guy for being a yes man again. Because I cannot tell you that if I were in the same situation with my wife and somebody stepped in and, in my estimation, gave me the rest of my life with her when I was originally going to get 4 years at best, I would probably be that person's yes man for the rest of my life as well. And I thought that was so interesting because I'd never heard that before from him. And it just illustrated why that guy defends Vince with every breath he has. I thought it was pretty interesting.
They are clear to point out that interview was conducted one day before the lawsuit was announced.
Ah, okay. All right. Okay.
Or within days before the lawsuit was announced. So yeah,
but there was a separation between there was a separation between the first batch of interviews and the hush money stuff.
Yeah.
The details.
The first batch of interviews
lawsuit,
were all done before the first Wall Street Journal story broke. Yeah.
Right, yeah. Which was, there's been 4 women paid a ton of money.
$17 million.
Right, yeah. But it was before the
Janelle Grant lawsuit was filed.
Right, which all the graphic details. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. I hadn't heard that from Pritchard either, and you hear stories of Vince doing good things for people. They're out there. You could research them. They're out there, and it's you have someone who is at times capable of such generosity, but also cruelty and depravity and evil. It's,
I mean, the cynical viewpoint, and maybe it's not cynical, maybe it's realistic, because that's how he buys loyalty.
I mean, that's what Shawn Michaels, he doesn't go to that level, but he says, Vince put up with me for so many years. In return, I give him my loyalty.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And that's the thing is like a lot of the people everybody they interview, for the most part, they have their entire, I mean, that's why John Cena, you think John Cena was so elusive with his answer about the lawsuit? Because the reason why is because Cena is who he is because of Vince McMahon, or at least from John Cena's estimation.
I mean, just recently, Mick Foley was talking about the lawsuit, and he pretty much said, "I'm going to reserve judgment because he says I owe so much to Vince."
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah, and I'm
so
not
many
saying
people
it's not
credit Vince for their success.
Mm-hmm.
Not just the opportunity, but for their success itself.
Yeah, yeah.
That it's interesting. It's one thing to be thankful for an opportunity, but so many wrestlers seem to think it's not just the opportunity. It was literally all the success I have is primarily due to Vince McMahon, and they kind of undersell, I think, their own contributions to their success.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, yeah, yeah. So I don't know. I think there's so much there. I think there was the opportunity to dive so much deeper, and even with all the little bits that you got along the way, it could come together in a pretty fascinating thesis. But it just doesn't, because it ends up being a giant WWE Wikipedia entry.
They posit a thesis in the trailer they don't even really fully investigate.
Yeah.
During the actual 6 hours of this. You know?
And the very name of the Mr. McMahon, that was obviously his on-screen character's name as opposed to Vince.
But it's not a through line through the whole 6 episodes. I think it's obviously brought at the beginning because he talks about, I don't want anybody to know who I really am.
Mm-hmm.
During the advent of the Mr. McMahon character during the Attitude Era. And then from that point on, there's a little bit of a through line because he was a regularly featured on TV.
Yeah, right, yeah.
But it's not really thoroughly investigated to the degree that it leaves you walking away from this feeling one way or the other about it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, right, yeah, yeah. And in fact, the last 2 minutes of it or so are just so it almost feels like dismissive of some of the more incredibly serious allegations. I mean, when he talks about the Rita Chatterton stuff, he talks about statute of limitations. Fuck that. No, yeah, we know you're not going to get arrested for it, Vince. We know that. Yeah. But like, if this happened, pretty serious indictment on your character as a human being. Absolutely. You know what I mean? Yeah. Like, what are you talking about? The statute of limitations.
Well, he denies it, but said, if it did happen, statute of limitations will run out anyways.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, anyways, hey, let us know what you guys think about the Mr. McMahon documentary in the comments below. Keep it civil, keep it clean. And thanks everybody for tuning in. We appreciate it. Until next time, we'll see you around.
Goodbye.